Perfect. Okay, great. The waffling begins. I decided that the waffling is my new favorite thing. Um, but I was thinking that I kind of want a way to thank people for being on time for Alive. And I was thinking the way to reward people for being on time would be that I could tell a joke. So there's some kind of like reward system. I didn't get my ducks in a row for this week, but I wanted to kind of field that, see how it landed. And I also would like to say that if we do want to do a joke in the beginning, I guarantee absolutely no humor. It'll just be that it is a joke and that's the reward. That's it. Great. I'm glad I'm glad we're into that. Okay, wonderful. Got some people joining us. Fabulous. Thanks for being here, everyone. Really excited to cover this topic. Okay, let's dive in. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Cybersecurity Stand Up. My name is Bronwyn Hudson. I'm your host, and I'm also the social media manager at Upticks. And today I'm joined by my coworkers, Crystal Ponish and Jack Roerig, and we have our feature returning favorite guest, Richard Steinen. Thank you all for being here. We're going to dive right in. I want to provide a little bit of context to this discussion, bring everyone up to speed. I think we have a pretty varied audience on this topic. We have a lot of attendees, and so I want to make sure that we're providing a complete piece of information here. So basically, the Cliff Notes is that last week, Gartner released the first ever market guide for cloud-native application protection platforms, acronym there being CNAP. A little more in depth, I would say that from my perspective, this parallels a trend that we're seeing in the market as a whole, namely away from companies having tens of tools and moving more towards unity and tool consolidation. And this market guide signals that Gartner sees CNAP as a real market, and they're going to be tracking it as such. They've established technical criteria, and they're giving end users advice on how to select vendors, which is a big change. So in this conversation, we're going to dive into all of this, but I kind of want to dial it back a little bit and start with a sort of broader question. Jack and Crystal, I want to go to you on this one. Can you tell us, we'll start with Jack, what is a CNAP?
CNAP is like a philosophy. It's not, I mean, they took this, we have all these tools, right? I used to run agentless and an XDR platform, two completely different UIs, right? And it was kind of, it was difficult to manage these two separate things. But I don't think CNAP is describing a tool. I think it's describing the tool that derives from an incredibly shifted left approach to security. So if you look at the way that we're managing risk right now, and you look at the way security teams are managing security, there's a whole lot of infighting. There's a whole lot of like security analysts trying to get priority from a development team to fix a bug. And the development team, of course, is being pushed to release new product and to meet those deadlines. So the developers aren't bad people; they're just trying to get their jobs done. And what CNAP is CNAP is this thing that says, okay, we got to make this tool that's consumable by the people who are responsible for fixing the problems. They need to be able to understand it. They need to be able to enjoy it. They need to be a part of it, right? And Gartner even goes so far as to say that in this CNAP, in this tool that exists, right, the people who use the UI are not in the security team. It's meant for consumption by people outside of that, and that's very interesting, right? So I think a CNAP is something that is just going to hit everybody, right? It's a way of making the security organization able to focus on strategy and building better programs rather than doing analyst work and explaining and negotiating.
Let's talk about that big change, because talking about the end users and the developers and these sort of different populations of people who this matters to. Crystal, we were sort of just briefed on this before, but can you talk about why this piece matters to a new audience, namely developers?
I'm not sure that it necessarily does appeal to a new audience or developers as a new audience. I always feel, so as someone who comes from the left and the developer and DevOps side, I always think about how much development and innovation tends to, unfortunately, outpace security, or that's the common perception. So developers and DevOps have owned cloud native for a while, right? I mean, starting in 2015, 2017, like this has been happening almost in the shadows, where developers and DevOps, they've really owned container security, they've owned code security, they've owned everything on the left. Just because, whether that's because of infighting and they were reticent to let security in because security was not on board, or maybe they never let security know. I'm sure, so I can only speak from my experience. I'm sure there are organizations that were a lot faster to adopt and innovate and introduce cloud native security to kind of the shift left side of the cloud. But in general, I think security has been playing catch up for a while. And so now I think, honestly, CNAP is the most progressive version we have of security for the cloud native stack. And it's really a combination of a few different tools, right? It's like if you were to ask someone in January of 2021 how they secure their cloud environment or their running workloads, they were going to tell you they use CSPM, they use CWPP, and they used EDR and maybe like an MDR service on top of their EDR. And so I think CNAP is taking from pieces of all of that, as well as XDR. And in this Gartner report, they outline actually all of the different markets that.
And you should note though, Crystal, those are all shift right tools, right?
Yep. Yeah, but I think that's only because there's been no other option, right? Like cloud native exists completely outside of the realm of security thus far. And so it feels like there's always this inherent tension between like the endpoint SecOps people who are looking at it from, I guess, like the shift right perspective, and which is also very much, if you think about it, like if you think top to bottom, like bare metal to most abstracted technology, like containers and cloud native come up here. And it's like because developers don't want to have to worry about hardware and we want low overhead, and these organizations want to be agile. They don't want to pay for like CapEx, right? That was the whole selling point of the cloud. So you're talking, yeah. So anyways, that's my perception, which is cloud native has lived up here in this abstract space where security has lived down here. And they're still playing catch up in this world. And so Gartner is really just like a CNAP is combining all those disparate tools and teams and actually turning this into a platform and a dedicated security solution. And so right now it's still like Gartner says, there's no one vendor that meets every single element that's necessary for this, but it's right now really a combination of tools and then an emerging category of platforms that are learning how to kind of shift left, right, center, up, all that.
It's an abstraction. You know, it takes all those tools, right? All these different subcomponents, and it abstracts them in a way that they're transparent, operating in the background. And what it's supposed to present is a high level risk to an audience that where that risk makes sense to. They're the owners of the risk, or they're the people who are mitigating the risk, etc. So it's all of those subcomponents still exist, but they interoperate in a way that is seamless and presented by a unified user interface.
Okay, now we're getting close to the contribution I wanted to make to this discussion. And first of all, just making sure everybody knows I'm not a Gartner analyst. I was a Gartner analyst 20 years ago. And there's a tendency when you're an analyst is, one, you're trying to make sense of what's happening in an industry. And for the last 2 to 3 years, cloud security has been very frothy. A lot of highly funded startups with amazing tools attacking really obvious problems, right? And a lot of those problems were just inherited from data center thinking, right? We need to do vulnerability management on our data center stuff. So now we have to do that in the cloud. We need to monitor networks. So in the data center, now we have to do that in the cloud. So those were all the early entrants. And they tend to follow that traditional path, right? We're going to do just what we used to do, but now we're going to do it in the cloud. It's going to be a lot easier to deploy, like minutes instead of months. It might be less expensive than it was before, but because you're usually dealing with a set standardized infrastructure in any one of the cloud providers, it's going to be a lot easier to do, right? A lot less bookkeeping to figure out what the configuration is, et cetera. The configuration of our standard container is this.
You don't need to get somebody to rack a server for you, right? The whole
right.
reason why people went to the cloud is because they could rapidly prototype.
Yep, exactly. Just get it out there.
Right.
And so the CNAP, which I'll be the first person to tell everybody that CNAP stands for Cloud Native Application Protection Platform, is Gartner's attempt to make sense of it all, right? And Analyst 101 is everything will drive to being unified. That happened in firewalls and network for sure. Happened with XDR on endpoint. And the same thing is going to happen for cloud security. But I would posit that it is way too early for buyers of cloud security solutions to immediately jump to, we're looking for a unified solution, right? Even if you use Gartner's short list of the market, that would drive you towards Microsoft and Google. And they are not going to be the ones that you go to begin with. Maybe eventually, after they've acquired those solutions, you will end up with one of those Uber platform providers. But for now, you have to look at what your specific needs are, right? Do you need cloud security posture management? If you've already shifted to the cloud, already have a lot of workloads in the cloud, then yes, you absolutely need it, and you better be doing something with it. Do you need the attack surface management solutions for discovering both data and your other assets? Yes, you do. Are you going to get the best of all worlds in a platform? That's what Gartner is driving towards. When they create a market guide, that's the precursor. Within a year or 18 months, there will probably be a magic quadrant, which we'll be able to stick those in. But today, when you look at these lists, which include Data Theorem and Orca and Palo Alto, they're not all going to be able to be squeezed into a magic quadrant. So Gartner puts out the market guide, and the vendors tend to start at least messaging and then maybe eventually moving towards their definition. So not to say that so Gartner is obviously really influential and is going to drive the market towards a application protection platform, which is great. I got no problem with that. But short term, keep an eye on the fact that you still have to talk to specific vendors for specific needs.
Well, I have a counterpoint. I want to play devil's advocate a little bit. And obviously, coming from a CNAP vendor, I'm a little biased. But I think Gartner came out with their first piece on CNAP maybe in like 2021, 2020. Mm-hmm. I think CNAP's been around for a while. I think this is a further evolution. I think this is like the V2. So I think we had early adopters and really innovators adopting CNAPs as early on as they could. And we do have a few vendors that hit that sweet spot between, because to your point, you're right, like IBM and Microsoft they're not going to be who you want to go to for CNAP right now. You have to hit that sweet spot between agility and kind of high security, right? Like shifting left and shifting right. So
no, I actually totally agree. And for an upticks, which is really early, it's very advantageous that Gartner essentially adopted your messaging and platform positioning, because you can say, yeah, that's what we are. That's what we do. But it also, because they have to be so inclusive of Lacework and Sysdig and, other companies that were definitely in the shift left arena, but shift left in the, way over in the on-prem development side of things. They're going to be chasing you, right? It gives you an opportunity. When that magic quadrant comes along, you can definitely be way to the right in the thought leadership side.
I want to point something out here in the report, right? So there's an actual quote in here that says, while information security typically is the primary buyer, the user is ultimately the development team or the product team responsible for the cloud native application. So what they state very clearly in this new declaration of what a CNAP is that the security team what they're doing is they're building the tools, they're choosing the tools, they're managing the tools, right? They're the maintainer of the tools, but the tools are to be, the rights and the responsibilities of you interfacing with these tools. This one UI that presents a bunch of tools is on the people who are doing the products, the developers, the DevOps. They are, let's be real, right? They're the Scrum teams.
Yeah.
So, it traditionally in security programs in the cloud. So I've worked in operations and security almost my whole career. So I've done dozens and dozens of cloud migrations. Typically, what I see is hybridized environments. Almost everybody has one, right? So I think a CNAP solution would work very well in a cloud only environment, but it also works very well in the data center. Just because there's proprietary governance creep that has happened in the cloud, it doesn't mean that I mean you could easily govern the cloud, right? It's things are changing very rapidly. But what I think Gartner's doing is they're saying this is insane, right? Developers are introducing security risks, and those developers need to understand what those risks are. It's part of their job. They need to be able to identify those risks and mitigate them. And we don't need the security team to middleman, but the security team should empower them and help them discover them. So I would say vulnerability assessment is more important in the CNAP world, right? Which is highlighted by their software composition analysis on one end, and then I love the way that they mentioned. Did you guys pick up on how they described agentless?
Yeah,
What?
yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah.
was the last bullet on page 17 of the
Yep,
report, right?
yep,
And
yep.
it was what did it say? It's like integrating into the key management system of the cloud to analyze at the block level for resting state risk or something like that. It was very
Yep.
simple.
Yeah, yeah. That was good. The one thing I objected to from their, don't forget Gartner's customer base. People actually pay them for services. Vendors are only a small part. Are end users at admittedly late adapters. So um, for Gartner to make their statements about by 2026, I think they're setting their time horizon that X% will have done this, is it's always important when they say that, because it means late adapters. That means the rest of the world has been there for years. By the time, I don't know, I don't want to insult anybody by saying who is a late adapter, but we all know them. The other thing is they surveyed their customers of CISOs and got an astounding 92% wanted to rationalize their supplier base for security tools. That you're always going to get that from CISOs. 23 years ago, when I joined Gartner, there were only about 15 cybersecurity companies, and CISOs, there weren't any CISOs back then, but the heads of IT were saying they wanted to consolidate their base too. And now there are 3,350 cybersecurity companies. So that's not a trend that's going to happen.
When did you start seeing, from an analyst perspective? Because I was talking about this the other day, that how there just didn't used to be CISOs, right? And I remember when I first became a CISO, there weren't a lot of them out there.
Nope.
When did you start seeing CISOs become more popular? Like when did they start becoming a regular thing?
Yeah, it was right after TJX, who didn't have a CISO when they were breached. I want to say the 2008 timeframe it began.
That's exactly what I was thinking. 2008. Yeah.
Yeah. And by 2010, I could go to CISO events and there'd be a bunch of CISOs there. I've met the very first CISO in the world. People kill me for not remembering his name, but he was at Citibank after they acquired Travelers. And Microsoft had a CSO who later became, the cybersecurity czar for the federal government, Howard Schmidt. And that was, we had all that differences between the chief security officer, which quite often was a law enforcement person, because they also handled physical security, and then finally the specialist in the IT security world.
I wanted to jump back to the point of tool consolidation that you brought up, Richard, which is about like this trend towards, like, we're constantly trending towards a platform, right? Because everyone always wants one vendor. Nobody wants to have like a single kind of neck to choke, essentially, right? Is what you want. But I also notice, I think CISOs that I've spoken to are they're either in between two camps, or kind of smartly understanding the trade-offs between either, which is, I think you can
Some of us want a million. I don't know what it is, but some of us just want to have like 30 tools And I think
Well,
it's further in our own careers to like,
well, I would call you. I have divvied them up into two, which is I think there's like a platform buyer CISO, and then you have a best of breed buyer CISO, or you have a CISO who's kind of learning to interchange both. I remember Jack specifically being a best of breed buyer whenever I interviewed him. Right, like you have people who realize, and sometimes you need to mix both. And I think I'm an advocate for mixing both. Right, like I think the old adage holds true: nobody gets fired for hiring IBM. The flip side of that is that IBM is not going to be your most like cloud native innovative company. They're just not going to be able to keep up with the pace of innovation. That's why you have these really small startups who pop up to solve these point solutions. So, because I mean, I've seen vendors in the space who literally pop up just to provide container runtime, right? And that's
there are so many silly security companies, Crystal, right? That pop up and do just this little thing, but it's also a Unix philosophy, right?
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
The really cool thing that you observe today is because 15, 20 years ago, not only was there best of breed, but there was layered defense, which back then meant you needed
It's
multiple
defense in depth is still still here, and it applies to cloud native 100%.
But for each layer, you only have one vendor in a company, that you've purchased. You do not buy two CSPMs. You do not buy two DSPMs. Whereas back in the day, you would make sure you'd have a different gateway antivirus vendor. You'd go with McAfee, for instance, than you would from your endpoint. You might go with Trend. Then you would go for, your file integrity or something like that. And people would layer that up because each one would catch different viruses, and you had to have them all. That's not the case anymore in cloud security.
Like Pokemon.
Exactly. I remember I used to run 7 antivirus products on my laptop because I knew I was infected with an agent from a Trojan of some sort from Russia and China. And I just run them all until they caught them, and they never did. So I gave up using a Windows machine. That was 10 years ago now.
Yeah, I've used a lot of tools at the same time, and I'll tell you right now, the reason why I did it is because I was looking for cost optimization. So for me to go with a platform service, I've generally supported SMBs throughout my career, and they were generally older companies. Turnitin, of course, was when I joined, we sold for about $2 billion to a private ownership company. We had never been IPO'd. We were never public, but we were founded in like 1998.
Yep.
So the company's just a very old company. It's processing a ton of data, and they need to keep their costs down because we were serving colleges and schools. We had to build a very bespoke security program because we couldn't just go to Palo Alto and say, let's just, hey, let's do it all for us, because it was like 4, 5, 6 times as much.
Yep. Yeah, we're entering a fantastic era because security is getting much, much better in the cloud than it ever was in the traditional way. So the best thing you can do for your security is move to the cloud. And while you're making that decision, if you're early, when I think about 40% of enterprises are still early and dabbling, and they still have this, oh my gosh, we can't move that data to the cloud because that's really important data. I go, no, you should move that important data to the cloud, and it should be encrypted, and it should be encrypted in motion, and you should store the keys somewhere really, really safe in a hardware security module. You should do security really well, but now you can do it with the click of a button and a bunch of purchase orders.
Well, Richard, I agree with you and I disagree. Well, migration to the cloud is not, they're not all the same.
No.
Right? Yeah. A very, if you're doing a very heavily funded migration to the cloud, what you're essentially doing is refreshing your infrastructure in a way that makes it modern, right?
Yep. Right.
That modern infrastructure brings with it new expertise requirements. So you'll have to hire an IAM team, for example, to manage your IAM rules. But if you're doing a Skunkworks cloud migration, right, or if you're trying to do it on the cheap, right, and I've seen this before, corners cut cause huge security risks. So rather than use the opportunity to refresh the infrastructure, a lot of things are forklifted. I've seen container environments built, that were built and managed in the data center, forklifted over to the cloud. I've seen cloud environments where nobody understood the IAM rules. One time I had a bug bounty person report an open Jenkins server with a default admin password, and the Jenkins server had a key to access every node, every asset, asset you could log into in production. I mean, that's like the coup de grace. Like that's like the holy grail of finding the vulnerability. Yeah.
I just want to interject that this is why lift and shift is not cloud native. And I think you had a really great point earlier, which is that cloud native and CNAP is a philosophy. Like it is a whole mindset shift. It's lifting and shifting doesn't work. It's not the same.
Yeah.
It's not just lift and shift. It's also understanding how to translate A to B, right? So I have a function I'm serving in the data center. I'm going to go build it out serverless in AWS, and I misunderstand how that works. And I think that there's no security. It's all the security is built in. I don't know, kind of worry about anything, or like the IAM thing I mentioned, right? You could go and you could do your best to build something awesome, but if all of your S3 buckets are world writable,
So here's a question for you guys. If, Gartner says everything has to be cloud native and it's now an application protection platform, all encompassing, do you stay up at night worried that AWS, Azure, Google is going to say, oh yeah, we got this, and just do it and make it part of the embedded cost and hosting with them?
I talked to somebody about this recently, about the same thing, and it was right after the last reInvent. And I remember seeing signs for this one competitor of upticks. They were everywhere, like just this company's logo was all over the place. I happened to have worked for the company at the time, right? It was right when I started at Upticks, and I worked for both of them, right? And I got into an elevator and there's all these guys there, and I'm like, well, this is awkward because they worked for the other company. It was everywhere. And then I was like, so I don't get it. Why do the cloud service providers produce chunky stuff? Why aren't they doing it well? Why don't they just, you know what I mean? Well,
Yeah.
number one, there's the whole,
Innovation and
the marketplace generates a ton of money.
Yep.
And all of those logos I saw plastered all over reInvent, that's money.
Yeah.
Right? AWS knows what they're doing.
I would say something a little different, which I think I'm going to be a little more diplomatic, just because right now I think it's really a complementary relationship. And I think it comes down to that shared responsibility model, or the shared security responsibility model. So you have to understand that really, really well for your organization, and what AWS is providing right now, what they plan to provide, and what you need a specialized provider for. Kind of taking, I think there's a really valid argument to be made for what I said earlier, is that the beauty of cloud native is that you can create highly specialized tools that are not weighed down by everything else, right? You can do that. And so AWS, they're always going to be not just AWS, any of the native CSP providers are going to be a little bit slower to market with the most innovative security things, right? So I think it's really about a speed to market thing and a specialization. And that right now you really have to have a third party specialized vendor to make up for the gaps in that shared responsibility model, is my take.
I actually agree with that.
And I actually hope that none of us are losing a lot of sleep over that. I hope everyone does.
We all want the world to be safe, however it is, however they're using.
Yeah, the reality is, though, that the cloud is responsible for an insane number of breaches, especially because of identity, right? We're seeing breach after breach after breach. It's so easy to harvest data in the cloud. It's so easy to find common cloud vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. And most of the odd thing here is that most of this is caused by simple cloud security posture management and cloud configuration analysis, which is one of the easiest to implement and manage things in the cloud, right? The cloud could be doing it natively very well. And that's a really interesting thing to think about, right? If a CSPM is essentially free, if it's commoditized, why is it not inbuilt into Amazon? The industry has agreed that CSPMs are a commodity, right? There's not a whole lot to innovate there. So why aren't they just by default?
Because I mean, like any software organization, they have priorities, right? Like they have a feature list and what are they going to get return on? And right now, most of the market is using specialized tooling is kind of what I think. I always just think about it from like the engineering side where you're just, I mean, to produce the amount of features to support the product lines they have, that's a massive engineering effort and product effort. And I'm sure they're ruthlessly prioritizing
I mean,
what to
CSPM is
build.
a piece of cake, but if they don't have it and these breaches occur, it creates a market demand for all of these IAM companies that you can go and peruse on the Amazon marketplace. They make a lot of money off it.
Oh, you think it's a conspiracy?
I don't think it's a conspiracy. No, I think it's Amazon's way of avoiding monopolization, but also capitalizing off of avoiding that monopolization, right? I mean, what's to prevent a company from vertically integrating everything? Why did the browser wars happen? Right? You remember the browser wars?
I do.
The search engines were fighting over each other, right? We had Bing, Yahoo. Um, the winner, of course, Google created Chrome, and it saves them a ton of money because they used to have to pay the Mozilla Foundation billions to be the default search engine, and now they don't.
Yep.
So it's
Who's the
interesting.
winner in that? Who wins though? Does the end user win? I
No.
guess that's definitely one thing. I do think the competition at this stage in the market is good, right? Because Amazon's not, or any CSP isn't providing the full breadth and depth of security features at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you, Crystal. Like, I mean, I think that if Amazon built everything perfectly, what would happen is it would drive a lot of the other companies out, and then they would stagnate their development on it because they wouldn't need to be a priority anymore. And that's kind of what I've seen with some other companies on the internet, where they've driven out competition and they've focused less on the excellence of their product and focused more on maximizing advertising revenue, for example. Not to name any names, but.
I think we maybe need a stand-up session about how it goes all the way to the top, like conspiracy theories in cyber. That would really take us in a different direction on this one, I think, but it sounds like there's some fruits here. I'm going to wrap us up because this has been fantastic and I want to release you all to your days. But I want to follow up by saying we have several pieces that are available. Jack has written a fantastic piece about new definitions of CNAP. I have that available in the link, via link in the comments. Crystal has a blog of 6 key takeaways from this document. It's also in the comments. Please feel free to check those out and go deeper and maybe start a fight with us. We'll just see what happens, And also you can download the CNAP market guide via our website as well. The link for that is also in the comments. These are all great resources, but we also really invite you to continue this conversation with us, whether in the comments or feel free to ping us a message on the uptakes page anytime. And a huge thank you to all of you for engaging in this discussion. This is a really important moment in the cloud industry from my perspective. So thank you all so much. And thanks to everyone who joined us. And we will see you in cyberspace.
Thanks, Brendan. Nice to see you, Jack. Crystal.
Bye, everyone.